you mentioned the 70s and 80s. In the 90s, we have the crack cocaine epidemic.
Oh yeah.
And,
Awful.
as a kid growing up, that's what I was always told. Like, that's what killed the projects. These were nice, happy places. And then that came along and just destroyed them, which, obviously we're learning here and from reading the book, that's not the case. Things were, it's almost like a business. At least the analogy I'll use is it's almost like a business that was failing. And then COVID gave it the last push and knocked it out.
Interesting. Yeah. That's an interesting analogy. Yeah. So when I interviewed residents, I worked on this oral history project with public housing residents, and if they arrived in 1940, they said this was the best place ever. It was wonderful. But by the time they left in 1950, well, it was not as good. And the resident who arrived in 1950 said this was the best place ever. And then 10 years later, I left in 1960 because it had gone downhill. And I couldn't live there anymore. And the resident who arrived in 1960 said, oh, best thing ever. And 70, that their experience was decline the whole time. Now, maybe that's human nature. Maybe, I don't know, it's where things get better. But there's a sense but when you look at the quantitative stuff and you look at the conditions, there's no doubt it's just this long, steady decline. And the 90s are the bottom, 92, 93, 94, the crack epidemic. Look, Vince Lane, who was a charismatic guy, ended up going to prison in Denver for FHA scandals, which is kind of sad. He, had these huge police raids. You bring in all the police, and we're going to get all the guns out of these buildings, and we're going to get the people who don't belong here, the gang leaders who are squatting and using it as a drug haven, et cetera. We're going to get them all out. And he tried this, and it was like absolute, it was whack-a-mole, first of all. And it was this enormous concentration of policing that picked off the residents who were, many of them who were perfectly good tenants. Some of them want the heavy policing, but then the policing comes and then it goes, and now you're back and it's just as bad as ever. So yeah, the drug epidemic was a disaster for those communities. Sorry.